Assalamu alaikum. Today I'm going to be teaching Biology Chap-4. This chapter concerns respiration and photosynthesis, arguably two of the most important biochemical processes in our whole universe, because we know by photosynthesis oxygen is released and by respiration carbon dioxide is released. These two gases, their interchangeable roles is the basis of the entire living world. Except a few bacteria and a few fungi, nothing can survive in this universe, well, in this earth, without oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, just from that discussion, from those few lines, we can understand that this chapter will be incredibly important for our upcoming classes, because these two processes, they have to be studied down to the last minute detail because of how significant this is. So without further ado, let's dive into our chapter right now. Chapter 4, I think it's called Bioenergy in Living Organisms, but I might be incorrect. My marker it's not acting good today. Bioenergy in living organisms. So to even start off this chapter, we have to know what is bioenergy. Bioenergy, I'm not going to write down the definition for this, but bioenergy is basically the mechanism of utilizing the energy that is produced in our body. For example, when I eat something, it gets processed, it gets turned into energy, right? This is my bioenergy. This is the energy which I have gotten from my food. And for a plant, its bioenergy is, of course, the sunlight that's coming in. It gets the energy from that sunlight. It gets the energy from absorbing the salts that are in the roots. It gets its energy from absorbing the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere. So through these ways, the mechanism of the basic utilization of how they use their energy, the mechanism of this is called the bioenergy of a living organism. Now the processes of bioenergy may be different, but the basic premise of bioenergy is the same for all organisms. Now, to even begin the discussion of photosynthesis and later on respiration, we have to know about three compounds. Well, a single element, I suppose, first of all. This is known as, let me grab my red pen. This is known as adenine. My markers are really bad today, I'm sorry. This is known as adenine. Adenine is a compound that is attached to our three compounds that we are going to discuss today. These are called adenosine, ATP, ADP, and AMP. This is adenosine triphosphate. This is adenosine diphosphate, and this is adenosine monophosphate. Now, you may of course have the question, this is adenine and this is adenosine, so what's the difference? The difference is adenosine, my marker is really bad today. Adenosine is basically adenine attached to a nitrogen base and 5-carbon sugar molecule. So when adenine, this compound right here, when adenine is attached to a nitrogen base and 5-carbon sugar molecules, it becomes the compound known as adenosine. Now, what are the nitrogen bases? We'll get into this later because it's thoroughly discussed in the respiration part and in chapter 12 of our biology book. And 5-carbon sugar molecule, it's basically, we know the molecule of sugar, right? When it has 5 carbon in it, it's called a 5-carbon sugar molecule. I don't want to get into too much detail because our class will be way too much long. Now, since we know what adenosine is, when adenosine is linked to 3 phosphate groups, we know a phosphate group is basically just this, PF4 minus. PF4 minus 3, yeah. The phosphate group is basically this. So when adenosine is attached to, adenosine is attached to 3 phosphate groups, it's called adenosine triphosphate. When adenosine is attached to 2 phosphate groups, it's called adenosine diphosphate. And when adenosine is, of course you guessed it, 1 phosphate group, then it's called monophosphate, just as the name suggests. Now, where do we go with these? We're coming back to these just a bit later. Now, our discussion. Well, actually, no, we can discuss this right now. So, why do we need these 3 molecules, or why are we discussing them in the first place? It is because these 2 compounds right here, adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate, these are incredibly, and I mean incredibly important for our day-to-day life in plants, animals, whatever you name it. Let me just give you a single example. When we do any activities, we spend some energy, right? So where do we get this energy from? We get this energy from eating food materials. When we eat some food materials, or even when we drink some water, we get a certain amount of heat in our body, or energy. Energy is just basically heat. But how is that energy processed? The answer is, whenever we eat something, the food materials, they get oxidized and they release a lot of energy. Let me just write it. Energy, or joules, that's a unit. Energy or joules, and this energy, it bonds with the already existing adenosine diphosphate in our body and an inorganic phosphate, and it attaches them and makes it an adenosine triphosphate. I know I might be getting a bit ahead with this, but let me just explain this. Hold your horses. ADP is a compound that already exists within our body. It exists at all times, and an inorganic phosphate that also exists at all times in our body because of the way it is. But here's the problem. In any chemical reaction, we need energy, or it either needs energy for it to happen, or it either releases energy. In this case, this is called an endothermic reaction. So what does that mean? It means the one that requires heat, or which one needs energy to be accomplished. In this case, ADP plus inorganic phosphate. The I means inorganic and P means phosphate, of course. The adenosine diphosphate and the inorganic phosphate, they're always present in our body, but when we get the energy in our body from eating foods, from the energy that is oxidized by oxidizing those food materials, of course, we get a certain amount of energy, and that energy is used here to facilitate this reaction right here and turn this into this. Now you might ask, why is that important? Because this one stores energy in itself. This one does not store energy, and this one stores energy. Now, from when we do any activities like running, jogging, walking, speaking, to even like breathing, we need a certain amount of energy, right? So what supplies that energy? Of course, we can just say that it comes from our body, but come on, that's not what it is, right? That's just way too simplified. The real energy comes from this one, adenosine triphosphate, breaking into an adenosine diphosphate and an inorganic phosphate. And we know that since this is an endothermic reaction, the opposite has to be an exothermic reaction. So this one produces energy. Okay? Well, let's just write joule for this. This one needs joule, and this one produces joule. So when the adenosine triphosphate bond is broken, we get these two, and we get a whole lot of energy. Now, what's the amount of energy we get? It's mentioned in the book. It's 30.55 kilojoules. So to recap just this part, whenever we eat something, the energy that we get, it's synthesized with adenosine diphosphate and an inorganic adenosine diphosphate and as well as an inorganic phosphate, and it's made into an adenosine triphosphate. This one here stores energy. And again, when we want to release energy, like for walking and talking or any activities, we require energy. And when we use that energy, this one breaks down and produces these two elements and gives us the required energy which we need to accomplish our tasks. Now, you might say, where is this energy synthesized? Like, which part of the cell? Because we know there are a lot of parts in the cell, right? Like endoplasmic reticulum, the rough, smooth mitochondria, ribosome, cell wall. Well, that's in the plants, but whatever. Lysosome. The answer to that question is the energy in animals is synthesized in, of course, the powerhouse of the cell. It's mitochondria, and for plants is plastids. Oh, to be more specific, we can just say chloroplast, because that's the only one capable of doing this. So in our human bodies, the energy is synthesized in this reaction happens in mitochondria, and in plants it happens by the use of chloroplasts. Let me just erase this, because nobody's watching, I know. I'm talking to myself. Oh, I forgot to mention the most important thing. For the reason of breaking down adenosine triphosphate, this is called a rechargeable battery. Why? Because, well, I already explained it. Whenever we need to use it, it breaks down into ADP, that's an organic phosphate. And whenever we need it, whenever we eat the energy, energy is supplied to us, it again bonds to make ATP. So it's just like a rechargeable battery. We can just recharge it by eating some food, and we can use that charge, I suppose, by doing different activities. So it's called a rechargeable battery as well as a biological quantity. Why? Because we're trading here. Let's suppose we're trading. By trading ATP, we get ATP plus inorganic phosphate, and by trading inorganic phosphate and adenosine diphosphate, we get adenosine triphosphate. For this reason, it's also called a biological. This is one of the most important B numbers in SSC. Like, if something comes from chapter 4, it's definitely going to do this. Now, moving on to the exciting part. We're going to go to photosynthesis right now. Photosynthesis. So, what is photosynthesis in the first place? Photosynthesis is basically just the formation of food or specific carbohydrates in green plants. Why in green plants? Because we know that there are 3 types of plastids. They are 1. Chloroplast, 2. Chromoplast, and 3. Leucoplast. Now among these 3, only chloroplast has the ability to produce food. The rest attract or store food. So what does green plants mean? Green plants mean plants that have chloroplasts. So that's why it's green and not other colors, I suppose. Now, let's write the reaction of photosynthesis, just the basic reaction. It's CO2 plus H2O. The catalyst is sunlight as well as chlorophyll. We get O2 plus H2O plus carbohydrate. This is our main compound here, and these are our byproducts. And if you want to balance this, we just go and put 6 on almost everything and just 12 on the first one. You can verify this is perfectly fine. Now, from just looking at this reaction, we can figure out the prerequisites that are needed to conduct this reaction. They are, first of all, oxygen and carbon dioxide that comes from the atmosphere, water that comes from, if the plants are terrestrial, it comes from their roots, and if the plants are aquatic, then it comes all around them because they're submerged. H2O, 3, sunlight, and 4 is chlorophyll. Without any of these four factors, the photosynthesis will not occur. I mean, there's not really much to explain here, but yeah, I think I explained all there is to explain. Now moving on to the next part, the CO2 here, carbon dioxide, it enters a plant through the stroma. Now, what is stroma? Stroma is basically this part. This is a cell of chloroplasts. This is a chloroplast, by the way. I'm sorry. This is a chloroplast. These are 2 guard cells. This is a guard cell. This is a guard cell. And this is the stroma. Stroma basically is just the open pore in the stomata of a plant. There are 2 guard cells in a single stroma. When it does not receive sunlight, these stroma close, and for that reason it cannot absorb carbon dioxide, and for that reason photosynthesis does not occur when it's nighttime. Yeah, that sentence is a bit incorrect because it does happen at nighttime, but the day process of it does not occur. I'll get to that just a bit later. But this is the basic structure. And then what else? We explained the 4 factors. Now I'm going to the next part. The main site of photosynthesis, meaning the main place where the photosynthesis occurs in a plant is its mesophyll tissue. It's the tissue that is called mesophyll tissue. Now, what is a mesophyll tissue? I don't want to go into too much detail because this class is going to be like 5 hours long, I think. For now, you should just memorize this, and this is extra important. I hope you understand what I explained so far. Let me just check if the camera is recording. It is? Okay. Now, moving on to the next part. in our atmosphere, the amount of carbon dioxide is 0.03%, and in the water, the amount of carbon dioxide is 0.3%. So, which one do you think has a greater rate of photosynthesis? Which plant, in water or in the atmosphere, like in land? The answer is going to the aquatic, because up to 1% of concentration of carbon dioxide, plants can fully utilize that for their photosynthesis process. And if it gets any more than 1%, X is greater than 1%, then because of the acidic nature of carbon dioxide and its toxic nature, the enzymes of the plants are going to get disintegrated, and photosynthesis could cease any minute. So up to 1% of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or in aquatic regions, it can fully use that. So coming back to this, so since it's under 1%, both of these, the one which has the greater number is going to have a greater rate of photosynthesis. So in that case, aquatic plants or terrestrial plants, whatever you call them, have obviously a greater rate of photosynthesis. Now, you might be surprised to hear, but photosynthesis also occurs at night. There are two stages of photosynthesis. They are 1 and 2. Light dependent phase and light independent phase. Before going into these, I'll just reference the scientist. The scientists which separated these two stages are Blackman. In 1905. He was a great scientist because this is a mind-breaking discovery, you know. Going to our first stage, which is the light-dependent phase. It's also like abbreviated as LDP, this one, and this one is LIP. I'll just use the abbreviation because it's too long to pronounce. My red marker is really betraying me today, but it's alright. So the first one is LDP, in case you can't see this. In LDP, the main process of photosynthesis occurs. And this, as the name suggests, it's light dependent. So sunlight or any type of light is absolutely necessary here without any exceptions. In this process, the granum disc of chloroplasts, or as we call it, I guess, the thylakoid, it absorbs the photon. We know that a light particle, an individual light particle, is called a photon, and it has energy. It does not have any mass, but it has energy because it's derived from this, I suppose. Then Einstein's theory of relativity. In a photon, there is a lot of energy, and when when the sunlight is reflected onto a plant, the chloroplasts or the chlorophyll of a plant, of the cell of a plant, absorbs the energy of the photon and uses that to facilitate the reaction of our original reaction, which we discussed, which was adenosine phosphate, diphosphate plus and inorganic phosphate. The catalysts are sunlight and chlorophyll, which in turn produces ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So as we discussed, I said earlier that chloroplasts or plants everyone needs a certain energy to facilitate this reaction, right? plants, they get this energy by the chlorophyll absorbing the energy from the photon particle and using that energy to facilitate this reaction and form ATP. Okay? Now, you might be thinking, since we're using this process so much, what is it called? Normally, the process of adding an organic phosphate or phosphate group to any compound, it's called phosphorylation. But in this case, since this is so commonly occurred, there's a different name for this, which is photophosphorylation. You can probably imagine why the photo is there, because photo stands for photon, which means light. Since light is here, we say it's called photophosphorylation because light is used to add the energy from phosphate to the adenosine triphosphate. So this is called an ATP or adenosine triphosphate, and we also get this compound right here, NADH plus H ion. How? It's not described in our book, and I don't want to bother going into detail around it. So from the light dependent phase we get ATP and NADH plus H ion. Now, the process of producing ATP and NADPH, sorry, it's going to be NADPH, not NADH, NADPH plus H ion, it's called, I think in the book it's called assimilatory power. It's a very important definition. Just use this. Then moving on, we have light independent phase. So as the name suggests, it can be carried out in the presence of sunlight, but we do not strictly need sunlight to conduct it because there is no role of sunlight in this part. So what happens in this case? So from light dependent phase we got ATP and NADPH plus H ion. Now going into our second part, we of course we haven't seen any carbon dioxide, right? So where is the carbon dioxide? Is it not there? Of course it's there. It's in this stage. After the plant has produced ATP and NADPH plus H ion, it opens its stroma. It opens its stroma and it absorbs the atmospheric carbon dioxide or the aquatic carbon dioxide depending on the plant. And it oxidizes them. It oxidizes them, and we of course know that to oxidize we need energy, and that energy specifically is supplied by these two compounds right here, that is produced in the LDP, ATP and NADPH plus H ion. So when they oxidize carbon dioxide, it becomes our favorite glucose. So to recap, in the light dependent phase, we got ATP plus NADPH plus H ion through the processes we mentioned, and then in the light independent phase, when the plant opens its stroma, atmospheric carbon dioxide enters in, and then the energy that is supplied by ATP and NADPH plus H ion, that energy is used to oxidize the carbon dioxide, and it turns into this C6H12O6, or formerly known as carbohydrates. Now we can of course draw a figure to illustrate the entire process. Again, I don't remember exactly, but let me try. Apologize, the camera just cut for a few seconds. But yeah. this is basically the rough figure. I do not remember exactly what the figure looked like, but this is probably just somewhat of a part of it. So, at first in the light-dependent phase, the Granin disc or the thylakoid, which is the main center for absorbing the energy, the chloroplast absorbs the energy from here and it supplies that, and it uses that to produce NADPH plus and an ATP, which then reacts with the carbon dioxide that is entering from outside and produces this one, of course. And then after producing this, that's where the interesting part comes in. The ATP is then disassociated into an ADP and an inorganic phosphate, and the NADPH plus H ion. The phosphate group is removed from here and becomes NADH plus H ion. So this is the basic premise or the basic function of photosynthesis. To recap everything, it's just in the light-dependent phase, by the photosynthesis process we get ATP and NADPH plus H ion, and then in the second LIP or light-independent phase, using the energy from ATP and NADPH plus H ion, we oxidize CO2 and we produce this one. And we also produce water as a byproduct. You can just write here, water as a byproduct, and some oxygen, of course. O2. That's the basic premise of here. Now, to go into more depth, we can learn the pathways, things. So as I mentioned, ATP and NADPH plus H, which were produced in the light-dependent phase, they supply and they oxidize carbon dioxide. Now, there are three different systems to how they oxidize the carbon dioxide, because it varies from plant to plant. In our book, there are three mentioned with two having descriptions. They are, first of all, it's called the C3 cycle. The second one is called the C4 cycle. The third one is called Crassolucian acid metabolism, or CAM. To give a very short overview of these, C3 is basically just, and it was discovered by Calvin Benson Basham, and the first stable compound is 3-carbon phosphoglyceric acid, and this one occurs in most plants. The second C4, this was done by Hatch and Slack, MD Hatch and C.F. Slack, scientists, and C.R. Slack. The first stable compound is 4-carbon oxaloacetic, 4-carbon oxaloacetic. Oh, that's good. And it occurs in mostly higher plants, such as maize, grass, well, mottle grass, it's not good, amaranthus, sugarcane, and more. The rate of photosynthesis in C4 cycle is higher. The number of plants in C4 cycle is lower because it requires more development of the plants. The C3 cycle has a lower photosynthesis rate, but the number of plants that use C3 cycle is huge. And for the CAM cycle, it's not described in our book, so I will not go any further. So for photosynthesis, that's pretty much done. I'm not going to describe the internal and external factors because that is something that is mostly memorization. It's there is basically nothing to be understood. Well, there is something that can be understood, but I think that you can do that by yourself. Now, moving on to the harder part of this chapter. I don't know, it's pretty easy to me, but most people say it's kind of hard. It's respiration. Now, respiration has 4 parts. I'm not going to go into that much detail, but the basic reaction is basic reaction is this. When a mole of oxygen reacts with, how can I guess? Balancing. When 6 moles of oxygen gas reacts with 1 mole of glucose, it produces 6 moles of carbon dioxide, 6 moles of hydrogen, and 38 adenosine triphosphate, which produce 686 kilojoules per mole of it. So if you want the total amount, it's just 38 into 686. That's the total amount of energy that is produced by 1 singular mole of glucose. Now, going into more exciting parts, we can classify the respiration, the aerobic respiration at least, which one requires oxygen, into 4 classes, I guess. Those being, first of all, the first one is glycolysis. The second one is acetyl-CoA formation. The third one is Krebs cycle. And the fourth one is electron transport system. I'm just going to briefly explain these by words because showing the figure will be much better. But you know what, I'll just draw the figure and show you simultaneously because that's going to be way more intuitive to understand. I'll just write them all back. This is the first one. First one is glycolysis. Third one is now, glycolysis is basically the oxidation of glucose, and then acetyl-CoA is when the acetyl-CoA compound is produced. The Krebs cycle is where all of the reactions occur to turn all of the products into ATP, and electron transport system is using that energy and distributing it to different parts of the body. That's the very brief explanation of it, and now let's move on to the more in-depth by showing you the figure and showing you what happens in which stage. I'll talk as I draw the figure because it's probably going to be easier. First of all, of course, we have 1 mole of glucose, which we have got from the photosynthesis process. 1 mole of glucose goes to the glycolysis process, and it produces 2 pyruvate C4H3O3 C4H3O3. These individual molecules are called pyruvic acid. What are they called? They're called pyruvic acid. This is very important because It often comes in the board questions. Pyruvic acid, and in this process 2 ATP is used here and produces 2 NADH2 and 2 ATP. In the aggregate result, it produces actually 4 ATP, but since 2 ATP is already used in the process, we say there is only 2 ATP that is in the neat product. Now, after this, 1 mole of carbon dioxide from each place goes out, and 1 mole of acetyl-CoA is produced by the oxidation or by the reaction of pyruvic acid with many other things. It's not discussed in our level yet. Acetyl-CoA. And in this case, when acetyl-CoA forms, it also gives you a single NADH2 and a single NADH2 on each side. Now we enter the Krebs cycle. We have done glycolysis, which is this. We have done acetyl-CoA, which is this. We go into glycolysis. We go to the Krebs cycle, I'm sorry. Krebs cycle. This one is the most important part of the photosynthesis process. Here, from a single mole of acetyl-CoA, we get 3 NADH2, 1 FADH2, and 1 GTP. It's the same on this side, 3 NADH2. 1 FADH2 and 1 GTP, of course. And we also release 2 molecules of carbon dioxide from each acetyl-CoA. And then the total reaction comes down to our original one, which was the total reaction of the aerobic process, which is just this. 1 mole of glucose here, 1 mole of oxygen, it's not shown. 6 moles of oxygen, it's not shown, which produces 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus 38 ATP. Now, let's count out the ATP, because of course, where is the ATP here? There's only 2 here. So where are the rest coming from? This is where the electron transport system comes in, because in this case, in the calculation, the electron transport system is not actually involved. The electron transport system actually converts NADH2, FADH2, and GTP, these 3 compounds, into constituents of ATP. From 1 mole of NADH2 we get, from 1 mole of NADH2 we get 3 ATP. From 1 mole of FADH2 we get 2 ATP. And from 1 mole of GTP we get 1 ATP. So now we can just calculate if our corrections are right, if our figure is right, and if there is really 38 ATP. Let me just grab my calculator. Well, I don't really need calculator for this one, whatever. At first there is 2 NADH2, which is 2 into 3, because from 1 we get 3 and from 2 we get 6. Then 2 into 3 plus 2. Then we get 2 NADH2 from here, so plus 2 into 3. Then we get 6 NADH2 here, so that's 6 NADH2 into 3 ATP. So 3 into 6 into 3 plus 6 into 3 plus 2 FADH2. From 1 we get 2, from 2 we get 4, plus 2 into 2. And from 1 GTP is equals to 1 ATP. So from 2 GTP you get 2 ATP. Here's the calculation, it's 38 ATP exactly. from here we can already see that there's 1, 2, 4, 6, and there's 6. So there are 6 total molecules that are of carbon dioxide that are produced in the total respiration reaction from 1 mole of glucose. Now, the calculation, we can just classify the calculation from this figure. Well, if you learn the figure, there's really no need to learn the calculation separately, because all of the calculation is in the figure. But if you want to classify it, here it is. From 1 in glycolysis, I know the spelling's wrong. From 1 mole of glucose, we produce 4 ATP and 2 NADH2. And we use 2 of this, so the aggregate result is 2 ATP and 2 NADH2. And acetyl-CoA, and 2 moles of pyruvic acid, which is this. An acetyl-CoA formation from 2 moles of pyruvic acid. We use 2 moles of pyruvic acid that was previously produced in glycolysis. From 2 moles of pyruvic acid we produce, what do we produce? We produce 2 moles of acetyl-CoA. Well, if you want to be more specific, it's called 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. It's just a bit of extra information. We produce 2 moles of 2-carbon acetyl-CoA. We produce 2 moles of CO2, and we produce 2 NADH2. So the neat product is this. And in Krebs cycle, we use the 2 moles of acetyl-CoA. So the use is 2 acetyl-CoA, and we produce 6 NADH2, 2 FADH2, and lastly 2 GTP. This is the basic calculation. And now, if we want to go into the details of where these are performed, then glycolysis is performed in the cytoplasm. Acetyl-CoA is also performed in the cytoplasm, but in recent studies it shows that it's apparently formed in the mitochondria. Since the recent ones matter more, I would say that you put mitochondria as the place where acetyl-CoA formation occurs, because in my exams that's the more correct answer. Whenever I put cytoplasm, they gave it as a wrong answer. And Krebs cycle, this is the most obvious one. This is what mitochondria is called, the powerhouse of the cell, because mitochondria is the main producing site of cellular respiration. This is the reason why mitochondria is called the powerhouse of the cell in the first place. So, Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria. The electron transport system is also occurred in the mitochondria. This is basically the respiration. Now, I hope I could give you just a basic understanding of how it all occurred. I'll give you 1 second to process it. I'll just erase it. By the way, this was all aerobic respiration. Means we require oxygen for this. There is another called anaerobic respiration, which we will discuss right now. So the second type of respiration is called anaerobic respiration. An means none. So anaerobic means something without oxygen. So the respiration that is without oxygen. So you may be wondering, how is respiration possible without oxygen? Of course, in higher beings like humans, monkeys, chimpanzees, fishes, etc., it's not possible. But in lower organisms like fungi, bacteria, it's actually possible. Matter of fact, the yeast that we eat, that we use to swell up cakes, that yeast swells up due to anaerobic respiration. We'll be coming to that right now. first, let's just write the basic reaction for anaerobic respiration. It is C6, 1 mole of glucose as per usual, with no oxygen, mind you, this time. Just do the arrow sign. Here, 2 carbon dioxides, some water, and this. Well, we actually don't need to put the water. And ethyl alcohol. Or plus, yeah, or just lactic acid. Plus 2 ATP. Mind you, the ATP here is actually different from the one earlier. The one earlier had 686 kilojoule per mole. This one only has 56, because the energy is not as potent here due to the lack of oxygen. Now the first stage of this is also glycolysis, because in glycolysis we do not need any oxygen to speak of. But research says that the glycolysis here is actually partially incomplete because of the energy in the second stage. It's not enough, so the glucose molecule cannot be fully oxidized. So it's actually called an incomplete oxidation or incomplete reduction of glucose. And this, the same thing occurs. Just one molecule of glucose gets now reduced to pyruvic acid, and then the second one is called incomplete oxidation. That's a reduction, I think. I might be wrong actually. Incomplete reduction of pyruvic acid. Here, normally in the aerobic respiration, pyruvic acid produces 2-acetyl-CoA, right? But here, pyruvic acid gets reduced to just carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol or ethanol, or it gets reduced to only lactic acid. So, the molecule glucose turns into pyruvic acid, which then turns into ethanol and carbon dioxide with 2 ATP only, or it gets turned into lactic acid or 2 ATP. Why 2 ATP? Because most of the ATP is produced in the, you guessed it, it's produced in the Krebs cycle, and since the oxidation of glucose is incomplete and the reduction of pyruvic acid is also incomplete, for that reason the NADH2 is also not produced here, so it's only 2 ATP, right? Because we produced 1 NADH2 and 2 ATP in our normal process, but due to the incomplete reduction and stuff, there's only going to be 2 ATP. So the total reaction is C6H12 goes to 2 carbon dioxide molecules, and then 1 ethanol and 2 ATP, or it becomes only lactic acid and 2 ATP. You may be wondering where the example of anaerobic respiration is. It's actually all around us. If you just look at a refrigerator, you can see the yeast there. The yeast actually is a kind of algae. It's a kind of algae that swells up. Why does it swell up? Because when it does cellular respiration, it produces carbon dioxide. We know that carbon dioxide swells things up, so when it does cellular respiration, since it can't get it out in the atmosphere, it swells up itself and expands its volume to give space to the carbon dioxide, which is in turn used in many industries like cakes. Lactic acid is also used to produce curd, cheese and stuff, etc. So that's pretty much it, I suppose, for chapter 4, because there isn't much else. This is it. This is purely just the theoretical part, because for practice and for applying, you have to, of course, definitely separately practice the CQs and the MCQs, because learning is not the same as writing, or input is not the same as output. For example, if I made you study for 100 hours, but I didn't make you give a test, or I didn't test you on anything, so 0 hours of input, you'd actually perform really bad on the exam because you haven't practiced outputting anything. I was just inputting things into you consistently. But as rather someone who has 0 hours of input but a ton of hours of output, even his one is not ideal, but he would do better than you in the exam because he has learned how to give exams, even though he hasn't studied. And the person who gives an equal or somewhat close time to input as to output, his exam results will be the absolute best. Because at the end of the day, many people think that just learning something will make you better in the exams. It will not, because exam giving is a separate skill in itself. You may be the best student in the world, you may have the most amount of information, but if you can learn to output that in a situation where pressure is on you, then you can't do anything, right? Because that's where it matters. Anyways, I'm gonna stop talking. Today's class was basically this. I don't know if I can make you understand or not. It has been a long class. I'll probably edit most of the parts and stick them together. This has been Safkat, and I'll hope you to see you in the next class.